The star chart was wrong. Overseer Velcarath noticed it first, not because he was looking for an error, but because he'd been staring at the same sector display for 11 minutes without blinking, and something in the familiar arrangement of light had quietly stopped being familiar. Sector 7 Gamma, human space. He'd memorized every light in that cluster 3 years ago when the Coalition formally designated it a containment zone. The lights were gone. Not destroyed, not dimmed, gone, as if someone had reached into the holographic display and simply removed them. 43 inhabited systems, hundreds of monitoring beacons, a border fleet of 6,000 vessels that had been transmitting status pings every 30 seconds without interruption for 2 years. Silence. He almost called for a technician to check the display unit. Almost. Then he noticed that his hands, folded carefully on the console edge, were trembling. The war, if it could be called that, had started 14 months earlier with an argument about mathematics. Not weapons, not territory, mathematics. The Keth Dominion's lead negotiator, Archspeaker Doran Vel, had presented humanity's representatives with what the Dominion considered an irrefutable proof, that the resources within the contested reach belonged, by spatial priority law and volume of claim precedent, to the 6 founding species of the Galactic Coalition. The math was clean. The humans had arrived 300 years after every other spacefaring civilization. Their territorial claims were, by every logical framework the Coalition recognized, invalid. The human representative, a small woman named Ambassador Yale Davin, had listened to the entire 3-hour presentation without interrupting. When Doran Vel finished, she looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Your math is right. Your conclusion is wrong." The room had gone quiet in a way that Velcarath, attending as a Coalition observer, had never heard a diplomatic chamber go quiet before. It wasn't the silence of offense. It was the silence of something genuinely unexpected being introduced into a space designed specifically to prevent unexpected things. Doran Vel had blinked his 4 optical membranes in sequence. Explain. Math describes what is, Yale Davin said. It doesn't describe what will be, and what will be depends on who wants something more. Nobody in that room understood what she meant, not yet. Velcarath had written in his observer log that night, "Human representative displays philosophical confusion. Recommend standard resource partition procedure." He had underlined standard with what felt, at the time, like certainty. That log entry still existed in Coalition archives. Later, historians would note that it was the single most incorrect document ever produced by a Coalition overseer in 800 years of recorded diplomacy. 3 mysteries, Velcarath would eventually identify, had been present in that room, and he had missed all 3. First, why had Ambassador Davin smiled at the end of her statement, not at Doran Vel, but at the wall behind him? Second, why had the human diplomatic delegation been so small? 7 people. Every other species brought hundreds of advisors, translators, specialists. 7 humans. And 4 of them, he would later discover, weren't diplomats at all. Third, and most disturbing, why had humanity agreed so easily to the Coalition's proposed buffer zone, allowing a full withdrawal from 17 border systems? A concession so large it had made several Coalition members uncomfortable. The Yeth Collective's ambassador had actually sent a private message expressing concern that the concession was *2 generous, that it implied the humans were repositioning rather than retreating. No one had followed up on that message. The war began 6 weeks later when a Keth patrol intercepted 3 human cargo vessels in the newly declared buffer zone and found them carrying not food or equipment but soil. 17 tons of compressed soil from Earth. The patrol commander, a Keth officer named Grath 7, had filed a report so baffled in tone it had been passed between Coalition intelligence divisions for weeks without anyone attaching a threat assessment. Who transported dirt across interstellar space? What military application could possibly justify the fuel cost? The cargo manifests listed the destination as a human agricultural station in Sector 4, which the patrol confirmed existed, which was operating, which appeared to be doing exactly what agricultural stations did. It was flagged as a curiosity and archived. Velkareth had reviewed that file twice. Twice, he had set it aside. What he didn't know, what no one in the coalition had thought to ask, was whether the cargo manifests were accurate. Not whether they were falsified, whether they were accurate, whether 17 tons of compressed earth soil was, in fact, all that was in those containers, whether soil was the correct translation for what humanity was actually moving, whether the agricultural station in Sector 4 was growing food. The war formally began with a coalition vote, unanimous, 7 species, 0 abstentions. Humanity's territorial claims in the contested reach were declared void. Coalition forces were authorized to enforce a mandatory withdrawal. The resolution passed in 4 minutes. It was the fastest unanimous vote in coalition history. Ambassador Davin had sat through the reading of the resolution, with her hands flat on the table. "We'll need time to evacuate civilians," she said when it was done. "You have 30 days, Doranvel told her. "We'll need 90. A pause, 60. She'd nodded slowly, 60 days. Later, when Velkareth reviewed the transcript of this exchange, he would spend a long time staring at those 2 words, 60 days. She had accepted the shorter deadline. She hadn't argued. She hadn't pushed back to 70 or 80. She had let herself be negotiated down to 60. He had never met a human negotiator who gave up a position without reason. The first engagement happened on day 43. A coalition fleet of 300 vessels entered Sector 6, well within the established buffer zone, approaching what their intelligence identified as a primary human logistics hub. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. The logistics hub was destroyed. The human defensive force, 12 vessels, was overwhelmed without significant coalition casualties. Fleet Admiral Myrathane filed her after-action report with an unusual addendum. She noted that the human vessels had not attempted to flee. They had not even maneuvered in the way that maximized survival probability. They had instead positioned themselves directly between the coalition fleet and something she hadn't been able to identify. A debris field that scans indicated was already destroyed infrastructure, already non-functional, already worthless strategically. They had died protecting wreckage. "Irrational behavior," she wrote. "Possible damage to human command and control systems. Recommend psychological assessment of future engagements." She was half right, the assessment part, but the irrationality assumption would cost her everything. The coalition advanced. Days 43 through 57 were, by every objective measurement, a coalition victory. 16 human systems secured, 41 defensive positions dismantled. Human forces retreated consistently, sometimes before engagement, sometimes mid-engagement, always in the direction of the inner systems. Coalition logistics were performing at 94% efficiency. Casualty ratios were heavily favorable. "The humans are broken," Doranvel told a closed council session on day 54. "Their resistance is fragmented and illogical. I recommend accelerating the final enforcement timeline." The council agreed. On day 58, 2 things happened simultaneously. The coalition accelerated its advance on the inner human systems, and every agricultural station in the contested reach went dark. Not destroyed, not evacuated. Dark. Velkareth was in the strategic chamber when the reports came in. He watched Admiral Myrathane's expression change in a way he had never seen a Keth officer's expression change. The specific, controlled fear of someone who has just recognized that the shape of a situation is not what they thought it was. The stations didn't go dark when we took the outer systems, she said quietly. They waited. For what? Someone asked. She didn't answer immediately. Then, for us to be deep enough in that we couldn't easily pull back. The room was very quiet. The soil, said Velkareth. It came out before he'd consciously decided to speak. Every head turned toward him. Someone find me what was actually in those cargo containers, not the manifests. What was actually inside them? The answer came back in 4 hours, when a coalition science team broke the encryption on a human data archive recovered from a captured station. The soil was a growing medium, but not for food. For a biological network they'd been seeding across 37 star systems for the past 2 years. A distributed, partially organic communications infrastructure embedded in terrain, hidden beneath agricultural operations, practically undetectable by standard scans because it registered as plant matter. It was, a coalition xenobiologist explained with poorly concealed awe, the most elegant communication network she had ever analyzed. It didn't emit signals. It didn't transmit in any frequency they monitored. It grew, and in growing, it changed the molecular composition of the soil around it in patterns that other nodes in the network could read through entirely passive chemical processes. They had been building an undetectable, unjammable communication system. In dirt. How long, Admiral Myrathane said, her voice very flat, has this network been operational? The xenobiologist checked her data. Based on growth stage, approximately 18 months. 18 months, 6 weeks before the war began, 3 weeks before the diplomatic session where Ambassador Davin had smiled at a wall. Velkareth felt the specific, vertiginous sensation of understanding arriving too late, of recognizing that the ground you thought you were standing on had been changed beneath you so gradually you hadn't felt it move. The concession, he said, the 17 border systems they gave up without argument. He was talking to himself now, barely aware of the room. They seeded those systems before they conceded them. We took systems that were already part of their network. We thought we were cutting them off, and we were. Extending their reach, Myrathane finished. Silence. Every position they retreated from, she said slowly. They weren't retreating, they were extending. This was the moment, later, reviewing the war's history, every coalition analyst agreed on this exact moment when the nature of the conflict changed. Not the tactics, not yet, but the understanding. Before this moment, the coalition had been fighting what it believed was a desperate, fragmenting civilization making poor tactical decisions under pressure. After this moment, a few of them began to suspect they were fighting something else entirely. Something that had been planning while appearing not to plan. Something that had looked at a 60-day deadline and seen not a constraint but a resource. Something that didn't respond to pressure by breaking. Something that responded to pressure by embedding itself more deeply and waiting. The question that should have been asked then and wasn't, because the council was already too invested in momentum, was simple. If the first 60 days were the setup, what was the actual plan? On day 62, the humans stopped retreating. Not everywhere, in specific places. 3 systems, Harkov's Reach, the Denali Corridor, and a barely habitable rock humans had named Bridgepoint, suddenly became extraordinarily costly to hold, not because of military strength, because of something the coalition didn't have a tactical category for. The humans had left people behind, deliberately. Civilians, no, not civilians. Velkareth read the coalition intelligence assessment and had to read it twice because the first time he was sure he'd mistranslated something. They'd left technicians, engineers, specialists. People with no weapons and no ships and no evacuation routes, who had apparently stayed willingly, who were operating the biological communications network, who were transmitting real-time data on coalition fleet movements to somewhere else. Coalition vessels arrived at Bridgepoint to find 41 humans living in a prefabricated station on a rock with poisonous atmosphere and 1.4 times standard gravity, running on backup power cheerfully. And this word, Velkareth noted, appeared verbatim in the intelligence report, asterisk cheerfully, transmitting everything they observed. The Coalition commander hailed them. A human man answered. He was holding a cup of something hot, and he looked, by every physical indicator the Coalition translation system could parse, relaxed. "You understand," the commander said carefully, "that we're going to have to take your station." "Sure," the human said. "You can't escape. You have no military capacity." "I know." "Then why are you still there?" The human glanced off-screen for a moment, appeared to exchange a few words with someone, then looked back. "Because the job's not done yet." The commander, Admiral Grath 7, promoted after the initial engagements, cut the transmission and ordered his crew to take the station. They took it. The 41 humans surrendered without resistance. The station's transmitter array was already destroyed. The humans had demolished it themselves an hour before, when the job apparently was done. Grath 7's report to the Coalition Council included a line that he later said he had stared at for 20 minutes before deciding to include it. "I believe these individuals knew when they were captured that their mission was complete, and they found this satisfying." He had initially deleted it, then put it back in. He was not sure the council would understand it. He was right, they didn't. The data those 41 humans had spent their last hours transmitting enabled something that the Coalition should not have been surprised by but was. A coordinated human counterattack on 6 simultaneous fronts, using positioning information so precise it suggested the attackers had known the exact location of every Coalition vessel for the past 3 days. 6 simultaneous engagements. The Coalition had never fought humans on 6 fronts simultaneously. They had never considered it possible given humanity's apparent resource constraints. The engagements lasted between 4 and 11 minutes each. In 3 of them, the human forces withdrew immediately after striking a specific target, not the fleet, not the command vessels, but in each case the logistics chain, supply routes, fuel depot tenders, maintenance vessels. They weren't trying to win engagements. They were trying to make future engagements cost more. In the 4th engagement, a human pilot flew a crippled fighter directly into the drive array of a Coalition carrier. Not to destroy the carrier, the fighter wasn't large enough to do that. To disable it. To force it back for repairs, force its support vessels to redirect, force the fleet to slow. The pilot did not eject. Coalition crews who had watched it happen through their viewports filed psychological evaluations in the days following. Several reported experiencing an unfamiliar emotional response that their ship counselors struggled to categorize. It wasn't quite fear. It was closer to the feeling one has when, Velkareth thought reading the reports, you realize the person on the other side of a negotiating table has considered your move before you've made it, and has already decided they can afford it. Because there was a second mystery now, larger than the soil network, larger than the coordinated counterattack. Why did the humans keep making choices that assumed they were going to lose, and yet keep acting as if this assumption was part of a plan rather than a concession to defeat? Every civilization in the Coalition, every one made strategic decisions based on probability of success. You committed resources when success was likely. You withdrew when it wasn't. This was not cowardice. It was logic. It was what intelligent life did. The humans were fighting as if this calculus didn't apply to them, or as if they were running a different calculation entirely. One where the acceptable outcome wasn't winning this engagement but something else, something not yet visible, something they were willing to spend pilots and stations and 41 cheerful people on a poisonous rock to eventually reach. What, Velkareth said at the next council session, do they actually want? Nobody answered. He hadn't expected them to. He'd asked it because he needed the council to hear that they didn't know. That after 62 days of engagement, with all the intelligence assets of 7 species pointed at one small civilization, they did not know what humanity was actually trying to achieve. Day 70 brought the second layer of the biological network. Not the communications infrastructure, something else. Something that had been growing in the same soil, alongside the communications nodes, classified differently in every data archive because it expressed differently, slower, deeper, less chemically active. The coalition xenobiologist who'd identified the first network spent 3 hours analyzing it before she called for Velkareth directly, bypassing standard reporting chains, which was technically a protocol violation, and which he later credited with saving the coalition from a much worse misunderstanding. It's not a second network, she told him, over a transmission she'd encrypted personally. It's the same network. The communications layer is the fast system, short-term tactical. This other thing is the slow system. She paused. I don't have a category for this. It's been growing for longer, much longer, based on the morphology, the root depth, the chemical signatures. How long? Another pause, at minimum 6 years. He hadn't been able to speak for a moment. 6 years. 2 years before first contact. 4 years before the diplomatic session. Humanity had been seeding something into contested territory 6 years before the coalition had even formally recognized them as a spacefaring civilization to negotiate with. What does the slow system do? He finally asked. She was quiet for long enough that he thought the transmission had dropped. Then, I'm not sure yet, but whatever it does, it's nearly complete. The growth patterns indicate it reaches activation threshold in approximately. Another pause, longer, 12 days. 12 days. He went to the council. He told them everything. He told them about the slow network, the timeline, the 6-year lead time, the fact that humanity had been building something in their territory before anyone knew to watch for it. He laid it out as clearly as he had ever laid out anything in 30 years of coalition service. Doran Vell listened to all of it with the patience of someone who has already formed a conclusion and is waiting politely for the presentation to end. You're describing an agricultural project, he said when Velkareth finished. An embedded communications system which we've already neutralized. You've said so yourself. The Bridgepoint station was destroyed. The rest of this is speculation. I'm describing something we don't understand that activates in 12 days. The humans are losing. Their fleet is at estimated 30% operational capacity. Their supply lines are. Their supply lines are what they tell us they are, Velkareth said. He heard his own voice come out very flat. Everything they've shown us about their logistics has been what they wanted us to see. The manifests, the withdrawal patterns, the positions they fought for and the positions they conceded. Doran, we have been seeing what they wanted us to see since the first diplomatic session. Silence in the chamber. You're suggesting, Doran Vell said carefully, that we've been manipulated for over a year by a civilization we classify as developmental tier in strategic complexity. I'm suggesting, Velkareth said, that we reclassify them. The vote was 4-3 against immediate operational pause. The coalition advance continued. On day 79, 11 days after that conversation, Yale Davin requested a direct communication with the Coalition Council. The request itself was notable. She hadn't communicated in 30 days. Coalition intelligence had spent considerable resources attempting to locate her in the past month, assuming her silence indicated that the human command structure had fragmented. She appeared on screen looking tired in a specific way, not defeated, but the way someone looks after a long project is finished and the adrenaline has left. I want to offer you an opportunity, she said, to stop. Doran Vell's expression, across the table from the screen, sharpened in a way Velkareth recognized as the early signal of considerable anger. Ambassador, your forces are. I know what my forces are, she said. I know what your assessment of this conflict is. I'm not asking you to surrender or to concede. I'm asking you to stop. For 72 hours, that's all. Why would we do that? She paused. For a moment she looked at something off-screen, something Velkareth couldn't see, and when she looked back her expression had shifted into something that he spent the next several weeks trying to name. Because, she said, after tomorrow, the topology of this conversation changes, and I'd like to have the conversation we're having right now before it does. I'd rather have it honestly than after. That's not a reason. It's the only reason I can give you without the explanation taking longer than we have. She exhaled. Doran, I have enormous respect for what the Coalition built, truly, and I know you've put enormous resources into this. But I need you to hear me when I say, this is the moment to stop. This specific moment, not tomorrow. Doran Vel said, no. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, the gesture, Velkareth noted, of someone setting something down that they'd hoped they wouldn't have to set down. All right, she said, then we'll talk again in a few days. The communication ended. The council spent 20 minutes discussing whether the offer was a psychological tactic. They concluded it was, an attempt to introduce uncertainty to make the coalition pause at a moment of maximum strategic advantage. The consensus was, do not stop, accelerate. Velkareth said nothing. He was thinking about the way she'd said asterisk. The topology of this conversation changes, not the asterisk subject asterisk, not the asterisk outcome asterisk, the topology asterisk, the shape of it, the fundamental geometry of who was speaking to whom and from what position. He was thinking about 6-year growth timelines. He was thinking about the word after. After tomorrow, the slow network activated on day 81 at 3:40 station time. What it did, what it had been doing, what 6 years of growth had been building toward, was not what anyone in the coalition had expected, because no one in the coalition had understood the category they were looking at until the moment it became visible. It didn't transmit, it didn't weaponize, it didn't explode. It connected. Every world the humans had settled, every station they'd built, every agricultural installation from the inner systems to the farthest edge of what had once been the contested reach. They came online simultaneously in a distributed consciousness network unlike anything the coalition had scanned for, because they'd been scanning for technology. This was not technology in any coalition legible sense. It was biology operating at computational scales. It was 37 worlds, thinking together, sharing processing load across a planetary network that had been root deep in the ground for 6 years, while the coalition watched the sky for weapons. The coalition detected it 4 hours after activation, when their own communications infrastructure began to experience what the technical teams initially described as interference, and then, after 2 hours of analysis, reclassified as something that didn't have a name yet. The biological network wasn't jamming coalition communications. It was routing around them, occupying the same space but in a different informational layer, the way 2 ocean currents can occupy the same water at different temperatures. And then the human systems disappeared from the star charts. Not destroyed. Velkareth had been staring at the display for 11 minutes when he understood, not destroyed. Hidden. The network had reached sufficient complexity to generate, and here the xenobiologist's report used a word she said she'd invented, because no existing word worked, a asterisk consensus field. A distributed agreement about what occupied a given space, generated by enough interconnected biological processing power that it could interact with sensor fields and return different information than the physical reality. 37 worlds, hundreds of billions of humans, thousands of stations, fleets, installations. All still there. All invisible to every coalition sensor system, simultaneously, Because the network beneath their feet was thinking faster than the coalition could scan. Velkareth thought about the 41 people on Bridgepoint, holding their cups of something hot, waiting to finish the job. He thought about Ambassador Davin's smile at a wall 3 months ago. He thought about 17 tons of soil. He thought, they have been building a hiding place for 6 years and they hid inside it, and we are looking at empty space, where a civilization used to be, and we don't know where they are or what comes next. He pressed his hands flat on the console to keep them still. They were trembling harder now. The coalition's first response was a full halt. Every fleet, every advance, every operational unit received a stand-down order within 3 hours of the disappearance. Doran Vel, who had authorized the acceleration 4 days ago, who had voted against the pause, sat in the council chamber and stared at a star chart with 43 blank spaces where civilizations had been, and said nothing for a very long time. The second response came from a direction no one expected. Admiral Myrathane, not the council, not the diplomatic corps, but the fleet commander who'd been fighting humans for 81 days, and had developed the specific respect of someone who has been repeatedly surprised by the same opponent, opened her personal communication channel and requested direct contact with Ambassador Davin. She didn't route it through the council. She didn't ask permission. She opened the channel and waited. Davin answered in 40 seconds. "You're not the person I expected to hear from," the ambassador said. "No," Myrathane said. "I imagine you expected Doran or Velkareth." "I expected silence, honestly. I need to ask you something." "Ask." "The network," Myrathane said. "The slow one, the one that's been growing for 6 years. It activates and you disappear from our sensors, which is," she paused, seeming to select words carefully, "an extraordinary capability, but it's a defensive capability. You're hidden, that's all it does." A pause on the other end. "Yes." "So what's the end state?" Myrathane said. "You can't build an economy while invisible. You can't expand while hidden. You can't interact with anyone. The network hides you, which means we can't attack you, but it also means you can't do anything else. You win by becoming unreachable. That's your victory condition. You become a civilization that has to live inside a biological cloaking system indefinitely to stay safe." Silence. "That's what I've been trying to figure out," Myrathane continued, "for 3 days, because everything else you did made a terrible kind of sense when I looked back at it. The soil, the withdrawal pattern, the Bridgepoint station, all of it pointing to this. But this," she stopped. "This doesn't feel like a plan. It feels like a negotiating position," Davin said. Myrathane was quiet. "You were right about the end state," Davin said. "We can't sustain this indefinitely. The network is extraordinary, but it's also young, and maintaining it at scale costs more than you'd imagine, and we have 43 systems of people who'd like to see a star that isn't filtered through biology sometime soon." A pause. "But the coalition doesn't know that. And right now, the coalition is looking at 43 blank spaces on a star chart and wondering what a civilization capable of this might be capable of next." "You built 6 years of infrastructure," Myrathane said slowly, "to create 30 seconds of uncertainty." "We built 6 years of infrastructure," Davin said, "to create a conversation the coalition would take seriously. The mathematics were always right, Admiral. We just needed them applied to the correct question." Myrathane thought about that for a moment. The question being, not whether humans have a territorial claim, but whether removing humans is worth the cost of not knowing what humans might do if cornered. "The question," Davin said gently, "being whether the coalition wants a neighbor or an unknown." There it was, the thing none of them had seen. The plan that had been operating since before the war started, since before the diplomatic sessions, since before the border negotiations that set the 60-day deadline. The plan that had used every coalition response as a stepping stone, that had treated every tactical loss as information, that had seeded not weapons but asterisk doubt across 37 worlds and waited for the coalition to feel the shape of it. They hadn't been trying to win. They'd been trying to demonstrate that winning against them would cost more than was calculable. They'd been trying to make the coalition stop being able to answer the question, what are humans willing to do? And make the not knowing unbearable enough to come back to the table. They'd been trying to make themselves into a mystery the coalition couldn't afford to solve by force. The third council session was the shortest in coalition history. Doran Vell brought 3 proposals. The room voted on each in turn. The first 2 failed. The third, a new negotiated recognition of human territorial standing in the contested reach, alongside joint development protocols and coalition access to the biological network technology under a shared licensing framework that Velkareth was reasonably certain had been drafted by human legal teams months before the war started, passed 6-1. Vel himself voted for it. After the session, Velkareth stood in the corridor outside the chamber for several minutes before realizing he'd stopped walking. He stood there, watching other council members pass, listening to the distant harmonic hum of the station's environmental systems, and he thought about a woman who'd looked at a wall and smiled 3 months ago. He'd thought at the time she was being theatrical, showing calm she didn't feel. But there'd been something on that wall. He checked, eventually after it was over, a data display inactive or apparently inactive, showing nothing, except that it had been connected to the station's internal network, and the station's internal network had been, he now understood, partially overgrown with biological computing infrastructure for nearly 2 years. She hadn't been smiling at a wall. She'd been reading something. She'd known in that room on that day what the coalition would decide, not as a prediction, as data, real-time, biologically processed, invisibly transmitted data from somewhere inside the coalition's own station. And she'd smiled because the data confirmed what she'd planned for. And then she'd sat down and let Doran Vell explain mathematics to her for 3 hours. Velkareth requested a meeting with Ambassador Davin 6 days after the treaty signing. She agreed and arrived at the coalition neutral station without a diplomatic delegation. Alone, which he'd expected. He was beginning to understand what alone meant, for her, not vulnerability but signal. He'd prepared a list of questions. He didn't ask any of them. Instead, he said, the soil, were there other things in the containers, besides the network seeds? She looked at him for a moment. What do you think? I think yes. I think the soil itself was misdirection, correctly labeled, because if we found it, it would read as innocuous. I think there were other things embedded in it that registered as soil on our scans because they were designed to. That's a very good analysis. What were the other things? She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of deciding whether to answer, the quiet of deciding how. The slow network has 2 layers, she finally said. You found both of them. We found the communications layer and the consensus field generator. Yes. What's the 3rd layer? He said. It wasn't a question, not really. She met his eyes. Overseer, I am going to tell you something, and I need you to understand that I am not saying it as a threat. I'm saying it as context, because I think you deserve context. He waited. The 3rd layer isn't active, she said. It may never be active. It was designed as a last option to be used in a scenario where the coalition chose to pursue complete extinction of humanity rather than coexistence, which, for the record, none of you were ever seriously considering, and we knew that. But it had to exist. She paused. It had to be there, because we couldn't know for certain. What does it do? He said. She told him. He didn't speak for a very long time after that. When he did, his voice came out quieter than he'd intended. How long would it take? Longer than the consensus field, but it would work, eventually. She held his gaze steadily. We are not the strongest species you've encountered. We've never been the strongest. We have no advantages in physics, no superior drive technology, no exotic biology. What we have is time, he said. Patience, she corrected. There's a difference. Time passes. Patience is a choice you keep making. She stood, and he understood the meeting was ending. The third layer stays dormant. It was never the plan. It was the proof to ourselves that we'd considered everything. She paused at the exit. We thought about it, Overseer, all the way to the end. We thought about every step. He believed her. That was, he realized, what frightened him most. Not the network, not the consensus field, not the third thing she described that he was already certain he'd never fully sleep through again. What frightened him was the specific shape of humanity's intelligence. Not brilliant, not superhuman, not gifted with anything the galaxy hadn't seen before in isolation. But willing. Willing to plant seeds 6 years before anyone knew to watch for them. Willing to leave 41 people on a poisonous rock to finish a job. Willing to lose ground strategically to extend a network. Willing to look at 60 days and see a resource. Willing to build something that might never be needed, 3 layers deep, just to be certain. Willing to think all the way to the end. Every other civilization in the coalition had a point where the calculation said stop, where the cost exceeded the acceptable, where rational intelligence set down the problem and chose survival over continuation. Humanity had looked at that point, had found it, had mapped it, had understood exactly where it was, and had then built infrastructure on the other side of it. He stood in the neutral station corridor for a long time after she left, watching her go, this small woman who had sat through a 3-hour mathematics lecture, and smiled at a wall. This representative of a species that had decided, apparently in advance and with great thoroughness, that there was no version of this situation where they would simply stop. He thought about every civilization the coalition had ever brought into formal recognition, how each of them in some moment of first contact had revealed the shape of what they were, some through art, some through aggression, some through architecture or music or the specific geometry of their territorial claims. Humanity had revealed itself through dirt, through patience and soil, and 41 people sharing something hot to drink on a poisonous rock, waiting cheerfully to finish a job that had been designed 6 years before they sat down to wait for it. The galaxy, Velkareth understood, in the specific, irreversible way that understanding sometimes arrives, complete and final and too large to unthink, had not met a species stronger than itself. It had met a species that had decided what it was willing to pay, and found the number too large to calculate, and kept going anyway. And somewhere in 37 star systems, in the roots of worlds that had been quietly thinking together for 6 years, a third layer that would never be needed sat dormant and patient and complete, a monument to the specific human capacity for considering the worst thing, all the way to the end, and building it anyway, so that no one else would ever have to find out what it could do. He found, standing there, that he could not decide if that made him feel safer or less safe. He suspected that was exactly how she'd intended him to feel.